say Alan
I
Noble.
know.
Welcome to
Sorry.
Apollo Swattered. Wait,
Sorry.
okay. Alan Noble, welcome to Apollo Swattered.
I'm so excited to be here. I say that on every podcast, just to let you know. But I am excited to be here. But I just wanted to be
Let's
honest.
try it again. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to be here.
Are you ready? I don't think I've ever started laughing before I've even got to do the greeting part. Okay. Alan Noble, are you ready for the Fast Five?
Yeah, you could do 6, but I'll do 5.
Okay, you're from the high desert of California, correct?
Yes.
But now you're in Oklahoma. So high desert or open prairie?
High desert. I miss
Why?
home. I miss the smell of onion fields. So not to jump to my book, but I do think that there are when you're young, there are part of being in a place, it imprints things upon you. And so, for example, I used to drive by these onion fields when I was a kid, thousands of times, right? Driving from our sort of rural home into town, we would call it. And it was very dry. And so whenever they water these onion fields, there's this smell of onions that it's imprinted on my mind. And so it's things like that that'll always be stuck in my mind that I miss, even though it was very dry and very, very hot. There were a lot of, kind of awful things about it, but it'll always be home to me. So there are very nice things about Oklahoma, but that'll always be home.
I understand that. I grew up in the country too. So driving by fields, being out in open areas, you can't ever get away from that. It's just part of who you are. It's part of who you are.
Exactly.
Okay. TV show that I am binging right now is
Seinfeld. My wife and I are rewatching Seinfeld. It's kind of a comfort watch.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. It was interesting. Lisa Kudrow was getting interviewed the other day, and she was telling a story about.
I think that's Friends.
Well, but she's getting interviewed, and she was talking about Jerry Seinfeld seeing him at a party, and he just walks up to her and says, "You're welcome," because it was his show that really got them a nice audience to start, because they appeared after Seinfeld. Interesting.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. Now you're also an English professor, and here's your question. If I were a character from a classic novel, I would be blank, and why?
You or me?
You, not me.
You. From a classic novel. That's a great question. If I were to be a classic character, Holden Caulfield. There you go. Boy, that sounds awful. Inner angst, overthinking. That's what it is. Overthinking. Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye. I tend to overthink things, be in my head too much, and that's Holden Caulfield. He tends to be in his head too much.
Well, it's good though if you're a thinker and you're also writing books, because those two have a tendency to go together.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's right. That's fair.
Okay, here we go. And your professor. So, funniest moment teaching in class is.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. So this is like my first semester teaching, one of my first classes teaching. And somebody brings a bird to class.
What kind of bird?
Like
got a bird for real?
Yeah, so it's like a 3-hour class. I'm teaching at a community college in the high desert, and somebody finds like this injured sparrow. Apparently not that injured, as you will find out. So it's a 3-hour class. They take a break, they go outside, and they come back in, and I see this kind of disturbance, like somebody's doing something with their backpack or something, and I'm trying to teach them, like, what are they doing? Because they're fiddling around, and there's some like movement with their backpack, and I realized they have something alive in their backpack. Now I'm really young. I'm maybe in my early 20s. I'm working on my master's degree, so I'm kind of like a TA, basically teaching this composition class. So I don't quite have the authority to say you're not allowed to have a bird inside my classroom. I don't know why I don't realize that I have this authority, but I don't. Right? So I worst mistake of my life. And so not in my life, but it was bad. So I don't say anything, right? And then the bird decides to be a bird, and it gets up and it starts flying around the classroom, and it slams into a window where this other student is sitting. And this other student just says, I think I just crapped myself. And in my mind, I think, she's literal. She's being honest. This just happened, and I'm fired. Like, this is how I lose my job, and my career is over. Like, she's gonna report me to the dean that I didn't kick out this student with a bird. And you weren't ready for this. I wasn't ready for this. Who would ever be ready for this, right? And I don't know how the bird got removed. I don't know how I survived that, but it wasn't literal. It was just a figurative defecation, and I kept my job. Nobody reported me that I'm aware of, and here I am today. So. But nobody prepares you for that. There's no, in the training, there's no, like, if they bring in a wild animal. So that was the worst.
What happened to the bird? Did the bird die?
No, the bird was just dazed and continued flying, as I recall. And somehow, and I told the kid who brought it in, like, you need to get your bird out of here. At that point, I was mad, but I was scared. And as I said, I thought I lost my job. It was so weird. The good news is, it was sort of like, everything's been downhill since then. Nothing weirder has happened, or honestly could happen from that moment.
Oh, that's good. All right, yeah. Question number 5. If I were a fashion style, I would be blank, and why?
If I were a fashion style, I mean, I would be 1940s men.
Oh, with like the fedora? Like the suit and everything, like the zoot suits?
Not a zoot suit, just like businessmen. Like, in my opinion, Western society declined when men stopped wearing hats and dressing properly. It's too late, right? I mean, you can't dress like that now. You look like a goofball, but
look at that. That is,
I do what I can.
Rocked that. I was like, what a fashion icon.
I know.
Got on like
I do what I
Green
can.
News boy. You even got a pocket square. I love it.
I know. I do what I can.
Got the professor thing down.
Am I a professor so I can pull off dressing like that? Maybe.
Do you have the patches? Do you have the patches? Are we like 80s professor?
I do have one sports coat with that has the patches. What I would like more, but they're expensive.
Yeah,
it's hard for me to justify that.
What was the reason behind those? Like, when did those come to be? I really want to know. Like, when did the patches
when you
come
put
out?
your elbows on the table, they wear out.
No, but I mean, like,
that's
what?
Legitimate.
Like, when did that start?
I don't know.
Like, is that 1800s or 1900s? Like, I don't think George Washington had patches.
I teach literature, not jacket patches. But that's legitimate. They wear out. Those things cost a lot of money. I bet they wore out and then they put the patches on. That's what it is. The patches came after. Because I'm thinking about it. Yeah.
Well, it's like when our grandparents, my kids came home the other day, and they had like their new school clothes, right? And it has all the holes in it, because that's been popular since we were kids, because I think we're about around the same age. We grew up in the 80s. And I remember coming to the family farm, and I was showing off. We had just gone shopping at like JCPenney.
Yes.
And I had my jeans, and they had holes in them. And my grandfather looks at me, and he was a farmer, and he's like, "We got patches inside. We can iron those on right away."
Yeah, iron on patches. Yes.
Back in the day.
Yes.
Okay, here's my next question. This is the question number 6, even though there's only a fast 5, because I see that your name is Alan Noble.
Yeah.
Oh, is it just for Alan Noble? Is that what you were going for?
That's what it sounds like, doesn't it? Oh, Alan. Oh, Alan. This is what I say to myself when a bird gets released in my classroom. Oh, Alan.
Or
Alan.
Henry. Come on,
Why
Henry.
don't you
There
kick
you
it out? You want to guess? Because you couldn't. You couldn't. So it's Orville, but it's spelled weird. It's Orval, like Orval.
Oh, like Marvel almost. Like that sounds like a Marvel hero character.
Orval.
Orval.
So when I was at a student at a community college, so when you have a weird first name, you have the pain of being called. So I would go by Alan, and then of course, roll call Orville, right? And so then what I started doing is saying actually it's pronounced Orval, and as a joke, right? And then and saying it's French, right? As this thing. And so then I meet this guy who's like really into beers, and he's like, well, actually, these Trappist monks make this beer called Orval beer, in this place called Golden Valley, and the Greek meaning golden, and Val meaning valley, and so there's like this beer, and so I was making this joke, but I was actually basically right at the time. I had no idea. The story I was told is that Grandpa didn't know how to spell his name, and that may be accurate. I have no idea what's going on at this point.
Did you name your? No, you didn't name any of your kids that, did you?
No, no. I passed on my son Alan. It's my dad's middle name. It's my middle name. So, but I didn't name. I don't want to do that to him. I don't want to do that to him. No. You have to try to be a good parent. I've been through that. Does build character, but there are other ways.
What the worst is when you have an unusual name, is the worst part is when you go on vacation and you're like at those gas stations in Florida where they have all of the different keychains with names on it, and your name is never there.
No,
and you always feel bad.
Is that really the worst?
Well, not the worst.
Are you really in Florida looking for your name? I don't think I've ever done that. That's actually the least. Get back in the car. Get back in the car. You gotta go. You don't have time for looking up your name and a keychain. You waiting for somebody to get out of the bathroom, maybe? Family member? I don't know.
Oh my goodness. All right, we have to talk about the book.
Let's talk about the book. Let's talk
about the book. First of all, oh my goodness. Oh, it's just funny to me because I just did that with my kids. We were in the Keys in Florida, and we came upon some getting like a t-shirt or whatever. We were singing the Keys, and it had names, and I never find my name. My name is not that crazy, not like yours, but I never could find it. And this is the first time I ever found it. And I found almost all my kids' names except one. So I was like, man, this
Travis? You couldn't find Travis, or do you have another name?
No, Travis.
Are you hiding another name?
No, Travis is it. But when I was a kid, Travis wasn't a huge name back then. So when I would go to places, it would be like Jonathan and Michael and that kind of thing.
Whatever.
Samuel. Yeah. So but today it's like all ththese kids, what's his name? Elon Musk named his kid, whatever that is, the formula. It's like E square, it's like a math equation. I'm like, I feel sorry for this kid. I just really do.
Yeah, but he's a billionaire.
That's true. That's true. But that's a lot of pressure. I mean, being Elon Musk's son, I mean, I don't know. He's a strange guy. All right. Let's get to the book. You are not your own.
True.
And belonging to God in an inhuman world. You got some pretty good you got Tim Keller riffing on your giving you some promotion there. And there's like, even I've seen some people doing some serious notes. I did a lot of notes here.
Holy cow.
Yeah. I totally read the book, dude.
That's beautiful mind level notes back there. I'm a little worried.
I read the book. There was so much in here because you're interacting with so many people, philosophers, and yet it still goes back to one really biblical idea that you're not your own and you're bought at a price. You were bought at a price. So what was the impetus? Why this book? Why did you write this book, and why did you write it now?
So a number of years ago, my pastor, so I'm Presbyterian, and so we read a creed, or a catechism, one of the catechisms every Sunday, and we were reading the first question and answer in the Heidelberg Catechism. What is your only comfort in life and in death? And the first part of which is that I'm not my own, but belong body and soul, both in life and death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. And so that was sort of echoing in my head, which is part of the point of these catechisms. And I was watching various arguments happen among evangelicals and people outside of the church about, some culture war issues and other political issues, social issues. And it just struck me that a lot of them sort of hinged on this question of to whom we belong. And it seemed to me that there was this stark divide between people who believe that we belong to ourselves, and then people who believe that or who ought to believe that we belong to God. And as long as there was that divide, it was going to be difficult for people to talk across the aisle. And I wanted to write a book that wasn't going to directly address those issues, because while those issues are important, it seemed to me that until we talk about that base issue, to whom we belong, and make an argument for that, those other issues, which matter a whole lot, we're not going to make any ground. And it also seemed to me that within the church itself, there are a lot of people who maybe vocally will say, yes, I totally believe that I belong to God, but maybe don't actually functionally believe that. And so I thought to myself, I'm not sure that we'll be able to weather modernity or secularization or the growth of technology and these sorts of things if we can't really internalize the truth that we belong to God. And so that's what started this book process.
So really, this is a book about our anthropology, like who we are as human beings. And as you've developed the book, you've gone through the book, and I'm trying to get into this part of it because there are so much that I had underlined. I mean, you hit so many different philosophers. You delve into modernity in ways that I haven't seen too many authors wrestle with it. And really, though, the part where you said, I am not my own, that part grabbed me because you've really rooted it in the scriptures. What I thought was a very theological truth. And one that I'd not thought of before, frankly, when you had mentioned it, the way that you had brought it out in that way. And I want to talk for a moment, the pressure of being our own here for a moment, which is what seems that modernity has created. Secularization tells us you are who you want to be. It's the Disney dream, follow your heart. Why is that such a, I don't want to say a thing that we're dealing with, because we know that it's there, but you've really tried to name it by saying this is where we are. We have tried to be our own, and it's a pressure that we can't handle. because it's a huge stressor. And I'm sure you see this more than anyone else, being a college professor and seeing young people come in all the time, which are really at the front lines of these cultural thought processes, because they're in social media, they're receiving this stuff more than anybody else. What are the things that you saw that made you pull back and go, we are not our own, because you saw the pressure? What were the initial things that you saw that really people were trying to develop themselves, if you will?
Right. So, as you said, being in the front lines, meeting with college students so often, as I just mentioned earlier, I wanted to do a project that sort of flattened the way we understand this, because there are kinds of books that sort of say the problem is out there. The world out there really has a lot of problems, and let's diagnose the problems with the world out there. And it seemed to me that while there are a lot of problems out there, the church has, in many ways, without knowing it, bought into a lot of these things. And so this book, what I like to tell people is, if you read this book and you don't feel any conviction, if you don't see yourself in the problems that I describe in this book, then you're probably not reading it carefully enough. And so, for example, with a lot of the students that I work with, they're raised in the church, they're taught in the church, they know the Bible. And yet, for example, when they get to the point where they're about to graduate, they feel tremendous pressure to choose the one right career path that will validate their lives. It's not just, I need to be circumspect and wise in the career that I choose. It's that their career is going to define their identity. It's that career is going to be what gives them worth and purpose and value and makes them who they are. I also see young people who are obsessed with social media, who get caught up with the algorithm, with posting, who are desperate to know who they can be, and who, through their fashion, through their clothing, through their activities, are trying to be someone significant. And of course, it's not just young people, right? I mean, and it's not just social media. Some philosophers, specifically Charles Taylor and some other, call expressive individualism. So it's this idea that in order to have an identity, you have to do two things. On the one hand, you have to express that identity. And on the other hand, you have to discover that identity. And you can't do just one or the other. You can't just find out who you are and then keep it hidden to yourself. Like, you've got to find that identity and then announce it to the world. And part of the problem is you can never stop announcing it. You've got to be projecting it constantly and constantly and constantly. And one of the things you mentioned before is it's an unhuman burden. It's this burden of being your own. Well, that's that identity burden. If you're constantly having to project yourself and express yourself, that's a lot to carry. And it's going to overwhelm you. And my students, I certainly see that in my students, but you can see this in a middle-aged person too, right? So totally hypothetically, you could be someone who, let's say, really loves fishing. And you might be somebody who thinks, I'm unlike young people, right? I'm not really on social media. I don't care about my fashion. I'm just wearing my old Bass Pro Shop, hat and shirt that's all tattered. But whenever I meet someone, I feel this compulsion. I've got to talk about my fishing. I've got to talk, I've got to announce to them, right? This is what I'm really into, right? And that's still fundamentally about this expressive individualism. There's this craving to announce yourself to other people. And if you don't announce what you're into, you kind of feel like you don't exist. What I think of is that scene in Back to the Future where Marty McFly's siblings start to disappear, right? That's what I think identity is for people, is if they're not constantly expressing themselves, they feel like they're disappearing. So that's one of the ways that I found this sort of pressure present in both my students and in broader society that sort of woke me up to these, what I call in the book, responsibilities of self-belonging. And there are many others that I think that create these inhuman burdens that we're all carrying around.
Well, you mention time and time again throughout the book, we create something that's inhuman. We've created a world that is inhuman. And time again, we create things that end up being really bad for us. They seem really good, but in the long run, they seem very bad. And you and I both know that modernity is not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. And we have to learn how to survive in it, which is why I appreciated your approach, because you're saying, all right, we're not getting rid of it, but we have to rethink our perspective on who it is that we belong to, because there's an immense freedom that occurs when we understand that we are our God's, and not our own. And the difficulty that I'm finding as we are still living in this society, and I'm still trying to digest your book because there's a lot. You were a writer that I feel is compact in that you don't waste sentences. I used to have a coach when I was in basketball, and he said, if you dribble, make sure you don't just stand there. You take it someplace. You use that to move you. And I feel like that's what you do with sentences. You're moving. You're always moving to another part of it. It requires you. You can't read you just passively. Yeah, at least that's my impression. Because I found myself having to concentrate, having to wrestle with these things that we're all dealing with, and you've named that I do find to be helpful, to be enlightening. And I'm still trying to figure out, though, when I understand that I am God's. I mean, yes, we can all give that theological awareness of it, but that doesn't remove us from the pressure of being online, of being within our society, of being removed from the relationships that have traditionally dictated who we are.
Right.
So how do we help people to even see this and where it connects with the Word of God? As you said, a lot of these young people are growing up in church, but they're feeling this pressure. And I don't know of any church that I can think of off the top of my head, I could be wrong, that's dealing with what you're talking about. But it seems to me this is exactly where people are.
Yeah.
So how do you recommend people? I mean, first of all, you'd say read my book, right? That's
right.
Get the book, but
yeah, sure.
Excuse me.
Yes, it was at the end of the was that the end of the question?
Be the end of my question.
Okay.
Sorry, I coughed.
You were in the middle of a sentence and then you coughed, and that was the
Yeah.
period. Your cough was the period, which is totally fine. So here's what
I
would
need to have
say.
shorter sentences. My questions go on for like ever.
No,
like
that's
novels.
fine. Yeah, so here's what I would say. I mean, not everybody needs to read the book. I would encourage pastors to take the basic structure of the book, and I tried to think through this strategically. How do you invite people to consider the alternative? And the structure of the book is an invitation to see an alternative. And I do think I teach Dante's Inferno and the Divine Comedy, and I do think the basic structure of the Divine Comedy is the way that we move towards sanctification, and that is we have to descend before we can ascend. And when we see cultural problems, we have to look at them squarely in the face. In my experience, a lot of people are ready. You said that one of the things my book does is name things. People are feeling these things. They need language to name them. And so what I would encourage is churches to put labels on things. You don't have to use what I use the language of the responsibilities of self-belonging. If society is saying you have to belong to yourself, and they're putting these burdens on our shoulders, I think responsibilities of self-belonging is useful language. You can come up with your own language, but the point is giving people language to see and helping reveal these things. I think that's useful. It's painful, though. That's why I'm describing it as a descent, because they're not going to want to see these things. It's a painful process, and as I said, they're feeling these things already, but there are a lot of things that we feel that we don't want to deal with. I talk at length in the book about our coping mechanisms, the way that we sort of suppress these things
and self-medicate. Right?
And self-medicate. That's right, because that's easier than acknowledging the inhuman burden that society is putting on our shoulders. So I think that the first step is for churches to help people look squarely in the face at the inhuman burden that society is putting on them, the burden to be their own, to belong to themselves. And once you've done that, then people are hungry for an alternative. They see this does not work. You're right. I am not satisfied. I am tired. I am burnt out. I am overwhelmed. Give me something else. I'm thirsty. I need water. What can you offer me? And that's when the gospel, and fundamentally belonging to God, is the gospel, right? And so that's when you offer that, and that's the encouragement. So that's what I would say.
I think that with your book, knowing that the gospel does enable that, in identifying it with the backdrop of modernity and how modernity is shaping us to be inhuman. You mentioned, though, as the society has progressed, it really has failed us as we've created this inhuman society. And you mentioned two responses. If I, and forgive me if I get it wrong, but you mentioned the affirmation and resignation. The way of affirmation and the way of resignation. Describe those a bit, because I think people do drift between, and you actually mentioned that, drifting between two poles is how you described that. Bring that out for a second, because I don't think a lot of our people, they do know something's wrong. They don't know what it is. They don't, they're just kind of carried along, as we were talking in the pre-show walkthrough, like, you know, the EAC, they're just carried along in these currents of thought and don't even realize it, but they do know that they're tired of the ride.
Yeah.
And there's two responses that you talk about. Describe what these two are.
So society makes us this promise. It says to us, if you will accept this burden of belonging to yourself, then you will live a full and satisfying life. But it never fulfills its promise. C.S. Lewis makes this argument that demons or false idols never fulfill their promises, and it's true. So the false gods don't fulfill their promises. Society fails us, and inevitably we turn that on ourselves, and we have to cope in some way. And I think there are two primary ways we cope. There are some who look at this promise and say, okay, what I need to do is I need to work harder. And that's the people who turn to affirmation, and we say, you know what, the system basically works. And so it's really a matter of my will. And these tend to be people who are high achieving. They tend to be people who are maybe from good families, or who are what we would call privileged, or who are just in a good position in life, who have been successful, who are highly intelligent, or who are gifted athletically. And they say, you know what, if I do my parts, actually, I think the promise is going to work. You know, maybe it hasn't worked in the past, but I think, you know, if I keep trying, it'll work this time. I just need to put in more effort. I need to put in more time. And so I'm going to turn to a life coach. Nothing necessarily against life coaches, but I'm just going to put in more into that. I'm going to work out harder. I'm going to get up earlier. I'm going to pour myself and discipline my will. I'm going to find more techniques. I'm going to, you know, to do more, and eventually it's going to pay off, and I will get the payout of a fulfilling and satisfying life that society has promised me if I accept the burden of belonging to myself. And then there are those who are resigned, who basically look at that promise and say, no, it's rigged. The game is absolutely rigged. The promise is flawed. It's fundamentally flawed. The only people who are successful are the people who are privileged. And I cannot compete because society is hyper competitive, and I can't compete in a hyper competitive society because I was not gifted with wealth or athleticism or beauty or whatever. And so I'm going to check out. And contemporary society is a very interesting society from a historical perspective, because it's easy to, at least in the West, you can check out and live a highly entertaining and fairly affluent, comfortable life. So for example, in the past, if you checked out of society, if you no longer strove, if you didn't try to advance and keep up, you would starve, right? But today you can keep, you can work a very menial job, provide for yourself, and get high quality internet, as long as you can afford internet access and you've got a phone, right? You've got access to YouTube and video games, and and pornography, and you can keep yourself entertained. You can connect to an online community, and you can essentially check out of society and say, I'm not going to play the game anymore. And there are lots of ways that can turn out. I mean, I think of, the most extreme ways. There are sort of violent extremism for young men, right? Unfortunately, there's ways of, of turning to that, but less extreme ways just look like giving up, just look like binge watching Netflix for hours. And I think, in my experience, a lot of people who are what I call affirming, who basically say, this system works, society works, I just need to accept this burden and try to create my identity and meaning and purpose and value and all these things, eventually they hit a wall. And I see this all the time with people. They think they can keep going, and then they hit a wall. They realize that they can't actually compete, and then they crumble, and then they become resigned, and they find themselves binge watching Netflix. And that's why I describe that sort of drifting between two poles. My sense is that a lot of contemporary people end up drifting eventually towards a kind of resignation over time.
Which is why you bring out the bell jar.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar. I was not familiar. I had to go look up Sylvia Plath because I hadn't been familiar. Tell us a bit about this story and where it comes to be within this, within your book, because you use her as a kind of I don't want to say a test case, but as an example of where this kind of lifestyle leads.
Yeah, so in my opinion, Sylvia Plath, the bell jar, she's got this main character, Esther Greenwood, and she's a great example of this. Esther Greenwood is actually modeled after Sylvia Plath, who is this brilliant woman. And Esther, at the beginning of the novel, is I believe a junior in college. She's just got this amazing internship at a women's magazine in New York City. Now, Esther knows that if she excels at this internship, she's got a chance at being an editor at a major magazine. She's also going to meet some poets, and so she wants to be a poet herself. So she makes connections. She knows, hey, that's going to open the door there. She knows also that if she makes good connections, she is impressive. She can get some letters of recommendation. So she's very excited about this opportunity. She also is interested in men, so she's excited about the possibility in meeting young men while she's in New York City, because she's from this small town. So this is her big opportunity. I'm going to go to New York City. All these things are going to happen. She's super excited. It's a highly sought after internship, nationwide search. Only 13 young women are chosen for this guest editorship, and she goes to New York City, and she buckles under the pressure. She finds herself bored, depressed, anxious. At one point, the editor-in-chief of the magazine calls her into the office because she sort of senses that something is off, and she asks Esther, what do you want to do with your life? And Esther realizes as soon as she asks that she has no idea. Now, by the way, asking a college student, what do you want to do with your life, is a terrible idea, because it almost always fills them with anxiety. Now, they rarely know, and that's okay. That's okay. They can discover that. And so Esther just makes something up. And in my experience, that's a lot of the times what college students end up doing, is they just make something up to please authority figures. And so she says, oh, I want to be an editor. And so the editor-in-chief says, cool. Okay, if you want to do that, go learn 5 foreign languages. And I think Russian was one of them, right? So like this incredibly difficult language. And Esther just thinks to herself, there's no way with my course load I can do this. I'm not, in other words, I'm not smart enough. I don't have enough time. I can't compete. And so she goes back and she has this to her room, and she has this dream of a fig tree. And she's at the bottom of the fig tree, and each fig represents a possible career choice. And one is sleeping with and having romantic affairs with lots of young men. And one is being a poet, one is being a college professor, one is being a wife and having lots of kids, and one is being an editor of a magazine, and one is being like an archaeologist, one is being a crew chief. And it goes on and on. It actually goes to infinity. She can't actually see the end of it. And her crisis is that she can't choose any of them. There are so many amazing choices that she can't choose any of them, and she starves to death in her dream. So to me, and so by the way, at the end of the novel, she gets access to contraceptives, and for Sylvia Plath, this is the resolution to Esther Greenwood's problem. But the argument I make is that this doesn't actually solve the problem, because it allows Esther to choose the romantic affairs with young men, and one other choice, because she's not going to have, unwanted pregnancies. But that still leaves an infinite number of career choices, because infinity minus one is still infinity, because that's how math works, in case you didn't know. So
says the English professor.
I'm married to a math professor, so that's how. There you go. We got it covered. We got all our bases covered. Yeah. So it's a fascinating study. So she's crippled by this spirit of resignation. She starts off with affirmation, but once she hits a wall, she's crippled, and she moves to a spirit of resignation. She realizes society is too competitive for her to keep up. But part of what moves her to resignation is choice paralysis. Part of the challenge of the modern world is that we have limitless freedom. Now, freedom itself is good, but limitless freedom is crippling. We know this when we go into the supermarket and there is an endless number of cereals available, boxes of cereal, and we just want to be like, can there just be one or two? Because I need to know, what do I choose and how do I choose? Well, and this actually explains some of the crises. And when I teach this explains the crises my students are going to. They resonate with this novel so well, resonate with this novel so well, because they feel this acutely. And that's why college students feel so much of a panic when you ask them what are they going to do with their lives, what career they're going to choose, because it feels like there's an infinite number of choices available to them, and everything. For Esther, it's not just what good thing can I choose to do, it's if I don't choose the one right thing, my life is meaningless. So then everything hinges upon choosing the right fig. And that's a terrifying thing.
Which is the dilemma of, the modern self. And she wrote this book in what year?
I want to say 62, but I'm probably wrong.
I know it was in the 60s. And to think that she was dealing with that then, to be so prescient, to be able to see ahead and people to resonate with that, is quite amazing, because I think that's why kids do resonate with it. And I know many adults do too. But we go through that and we see that society does really fail in the promises and how we respond. You mentioned that as we self-medicate, which is something that I'm seeing more and more people dealing with. The stats don't lie. We're some of the most anxious people that have been on the planet in our time. And even though we have all the modern things that should help it, we're really not.
Yeah.
Why introduce this though? And have you got a response to people saying, okay, no, because some people will respond and say, you don't know what you're talking about. We deserve this. We need this. Have you had that, or am I way off there?
With the self-medication?
Yeah.
I haven't really. I think for the most part, one of the early readers was a little skeptical that we all self-medicate, but I think that was more of a rhetorical move. I'm sure somebody out there doesn't self-medicate, but but I think for the vast majority of us in the West, in some way or another, in some harmful way, we are self-medicating. And I tried to offer an expansive definition, because we tend to have this very narrow view, and I think it tends to be a sort of classist view of self-medication, right? So we tend to think, well, I'm not an alcoholic, and I'm not smoking weed or doing heroin or something like that, so I'm not self-medicating. But when we include things like shopping therapy, what's it called? Is that what it's called? And when we include things like binge watching, and when we include things like doom scrolling, and
doom scrolling, what's that? Just scrolling forever and seeing bad headlines or something?
That's right. Yeah, when you're sort of addicted to watching the horrible, awful news.
Okay.
Which seems like it would be the opposite of self-medicating, because you're focused on the terrible political things that are going on around you and in the world, right? You're constantly reading the worst news about what's going on with past presidents, hypothetically, or what's going on in Ukraine or whatever. With viruses or inflation. How would that be self-medicating? But what it does is it gets the pressure off of you, right? We talked about this, right? So how do you cope with these things that you feel, these pressures of belonging to yourself? Well, you externalize them. You focus on what's going on externally in the world, which you can't really do anything about. And there's a freedom in that, right? If I'm obsessively focused on what an out of control politician is doing, there's a relief in that, because then all I can do is rant myself on social media, but I don't really have any agency. But that's liberating. That's liberating, because I can, on the one hand, feel like I'm doing something, but on the other hand, I'm not doing anything meaningful. But I'm distracting myself from all this angst and anxiety and pressure that's really bottling up inside of me, that I'm trying to bottle up inside of me. So yeah, even doom scrolling can be a kind of way that we self-medicate. So I really haven't had many people push back against that. Once I've introduced the idea and given a long enough list and acknowledged that a lot of these things, like I think exercise can be a way we self-medicate. And a lot of these things can be good and healthy. Reading things in the news can be good and, actually, is good and healthy. But there are ways of doing these things that are forms of medication, ways that we distract ourselves from and cope in unhealthy ways. Once we acknowledge that, I think a lot of people say, oh, gosh, man, that hits, that resonates. So far, I haven't. I'm sure somebody has found that objectionable. They just haven't written to me.
The one thing that, the self-medicate part, I think, I don't know too many people would disagree with in that, but it was the technique part. When you brought up technique, I didn't bristle. I went, oh no, because I know some people that are all about technique, and if I have the right system, and if I do this, here we go. Yeah. And I was like, kind of like shifting the book over, hoping, they're sitting beside me going, just take a read, just read a couple paragraphs here.
Yeah.
First of all, describe what technique is so we can bring our people along here. And you introduce a nice philosopher here with that technique. Help other people know who our friend Jacques, I don't even know if I could say it right. Jacques Ellul, is that how you say it?
That's how I say it. Jacques Ellul.
Jacques Ellul, and why he is such an important person to listen to, simply because you quote him quite a bit.
I do.
In the book.
Yeah. So I judge scholars by their names. And it's not a great idea. But Jacques Ellul, because I give talks.
No, you talk about Charles Taylor too.
He's the worst. He's the worst name. So boring. So boring. Charles Taylor, right? What kind of name is
Chuck,
Chuck. I should start calling him Chuck Taylor. And wear
I love
Chuck
your
Taylors.
shoes.
And wear
Yeah,
Chuck Taylors, right? And then point to him. That would be good. Another one of my favorites, Zygmunt Bauman. I don't even know if I'm saying Zygmunt
Yeah, you
Bauman.
talk about him because he does the liquid modernity. You talk
Yeah,
about him for
because his
liquid
name
modernity.
is great, right?
I know, I loved it. It's a fun name. Is he
It's
Polish?
a fun name. Yeah, I believe he is. He is.
Okay.
I'm gonna say he is. Yeah.
That's a fun name.
So Jacques Ellul has this concept of technique, and what he says, the way to paraphrase, he roughly defines that technique is the effort to maximize efficiency, methods of maximizing efficiency in every sphere of human activity. All right. So it's not just being efficient, but it's methods of maximizing efficiency when we apply it everywhere. And his thesis in a technological society is that in the modern world, we're not just trying to be efficient, we're trying to be efficient in every place. One of the examples I gave in the book is that when I was actually writing this section, I'm a side sleeper. I love sleeping on my side, and because I'm getting old, my shoulder was starting to bother me. And so I searched for, on Google, why is my shoulder hurting when I'm sleeping on my side? And one of the first things that came up is the one right method for side sleeping. And I didn't know this existed, but I should have known that there is a one right technique for sleeping on your side. And it's like this scientifically, I don't know actually if it's scientific, but it probably is a scientifically proven method, the one right technique. And if you're not doing it that way, of course you're going to get hurt. And you intuitively know this because we're in this sort of society that if you're doing anything, right? If you're, laundry, teaching, preaching, talking to people, raising kids. I think parenting is one of the most places where you feel this acutely, because there's a lot of guilt involved with parenting if you're not, potty training, and it goes all through, for the rest of your life, right? Your rest of your parenting, there's proper techniques of doing everything involved in parenting, disciplining, right? Reading to your kids, teaching them math, teaching them to do chores, everything, right? And if you don't do it properly, the one right way, then you're being a bad parent and you're going to ruin them in some way, and you better save up for counseling and whatever. That's the joke, but there's this sort of hidden truth or this implication that it's kind of true, right? And so Ellul's argument is that technique goes everywhere and it runs roughshod over all other values. So he's not opposed to efficiency. He's not saying that, hey, you should never be efficient. Don't intentionally wash dishes in the most inefficient way possible. But what he is saying is that what technique does in contemporary society is, if there is a more efficient way to do things, technique is going to pressure you to adopt that more efficient method, whether there are other values that would encourage you to choose less efficient methods or not. And this is particularly important for Christians because we have other values that are superior to efficiency. So things like beauty, truth, goodness, the spiritual virtues, right? Faith, hope, and love. There are times when we have to do things that our college president here at Oklahoma Baptist University says that, for example, our education is beautifully inefficient, right? To sit around and read literature in some respects is inefficient. Right? There are more efficient ways of getting an education. But if you value truth, if you value goodness, if you value beauty, then you have to do things that are inefficient. And so that's what Ellul's argument is, sort of the two parts there. One is that technique overcomes all other things and pressures us to adopt efficiency. And you see that again, I think the great example is in parenting. There's this constant guilt, this constant pressure to adopt the one right way of doing everything. And you get this pressure in, you're reading headlines, here's the right way to do things, you're getting it in social media, you're getting it everywhere. And the other thing to note is that it all other values become secondary or tertiary, or actually they're irrelevant. They just don't really matter.
A lot of these belief systems and the efficiency has found its way into the church itself. And the church,
Oh
I
yeah.
think, has become a propagator of that. And it's become a bit of a Trojan horse. You know, the modernity has come in and really kind of destroyed them from the outside, even though they talk about making disciples and doing it the best way. But implicit within that are those seeds of destruction that the church is, I think, sown and not realize it. And I think COVID brought that to bear, because
Yeah.
suddenly people disappeared from church and now they're not coming back because they haven't understood the dynamic, the essential nature of relationships and embodiment
Yeah.
within the church. And to me, that's just a product of modernity. The reason that people have stayed away is because they have never been taught how needed the church is and essential. It's just, give me Jesus. I've prayed the prayer, I've gotten saved, and I'm good. And you're seeing that within the Southeast right now. I mean, within the proverbial Bible Belt. Russell Moore ran an article, I think it came out the day before yesterday, on the South, and a lot of people that are leaving the church in the South, they're maintaining a lot of their convictions on some things like abortion, but they're not on premarital sex or living together, and even in the essential nature of going to church. So what I like about your thesis is you're bringing it back in, saying you're not your own. You don't have, I mean, there is a freedom in not being your own and having to choose all these things. Like you said, limitless freedom is unbearable.
Yeah.
It's freedom with limits. It's also an understanding that you have a responsibility and that you belong not only to God, but to a people.
Yeah.
And you're engaged with that people. And that's what I found to be so illuminating as you've written, not being our own, but belonging to Christ. I'm trying to find this other part in here, because you had so many different pieces and so many things to bring out. But you mentioned here, talking about technique. I want to go back to technique for a minute, because some people will say, well, what's wrong though with technique? And as you said, efficiency isn't always, it's not a bad thing. But it's not the only thing. And you mentioned defining the problem, explaining why it exists, develop a targeted solution. This isn't you saying that we need to do this. This is how we have gone about it.
Yeah.
And implement the solution. And the idea is we think there's a solution to every problem, or there's a one way to do everything. And there's not always one way. Like I tell people, only God was a perfect parent and we still rebel.
Yeah.
You know, so there's not this, but I hear people say that. Like, I thought I had one woman tell me, she was my hygienist, my dental hygienist. And she fully said, I was told that if I homeschooled my kids, they would interrupt, like they would go to heaven, basically. And I know that seems extreme, but her children had both rebelled. And I thought to myself, I'm like, there's not just one way to do it. I've seen other parents come to me and they say, well, this is a biblical parenting model. What biblical parenting model is it? I don't remember Jesus giving us a biblical parenting model. And I asked one guy to tell me, I said, what is this biblical parenting model? And his children are grown now, but he said, well, there's a blanket and you put the child on the blanket. And so they understand limits. And I'm like, oh, where's that at in scripture? There's nowhere that this stuff is in there, but everybody just slaps this biblical label on it, as if this is the biblical idea of parenting. Yes, the Bible teaches individual responsibility. It teaches leading people, being there for them, loving them, encouraging, forgiving them. But a blanket or one form of school is going to be the determiner of your child's future. That's just an unbearable. I mean, it's not true. It's not biblical at all. So with you seeing a lot of that, I mean, how do you I don't want to say how do you respond? I mean, you responded by writing a book, but why is it, I guess, that we need to know that we are not our own? I mean, I've elaborated on it, but I want you to describe it a little bit more.
You know, that passage you read, if I remember the context, I'm actually talking about the fact that I can't actually give a 5-step plan to fixing society. This is one of the most challenging parts of the book, is that once you accept that you are not your own, it gives you peace. And this is something you mentioned earlier. Society's still going to pressure you.
Mm.
So here's an example. Here's an example. Let's say you have a stay-at-home mom who's highly educated, somebody who could have a career, but she understands the value, and just for various life reasons, it's great to work, but for various life reasons, she's choosing to stay home, and she knows that it's a beautiful thing to stay home with your children,
Mhm.
and that's a choice that she's making, that their family is making, and it's God honoring, and that she's no less of a person for staying home with her children, that having a career doesn't make her doesn't give her identity, that it doesn't define her, that it's not the one thing that's going to give her worth, that her worth is in God, belonging to God. Her identity is grounded in God's love for her, these sorts of things. But the fact is that when she goes and she meets other adults, it's not going to be uncommon for even people who in theory love the idea of stay-at-home moms, who think maybe that women should stay at home and shouldn't have jobs. It's not going to be uncommon for them when they meet her, other women in fact, to say, what do you do? When she says, "Oh, I stay home with the kids." "Oh, that's great. So what does your husband do?" And there to be this sort of flip it, just sort of, there's nothing interesting about you, you know, and that adds up. That adds up to this kind of pressure, which is what you described. So even when you can internalize and you can acknowledge and you can accept, okay, my identity is grounded in God's witness to my existence in the world. My purpose is grounded in God's love for me and his acknowledgement and purpose he has given for me. I get my meaning from God, my value, all these sorts of things. Society is still going to be saying, tap, tap, hey, you know what? Pick up this burden, pick up this boulder, put it back on your shoulder and start carrying it up the mountain again. This is your job. Pick it back up every day, over and over again. And so one of the things I've been telling people is that this is not, sometimes people on Instagram will say you need a mindset change. You just got to change your mindset, and then mindset fix, and then you're good.
Mm.
And I'm sorry, this is not that. This is not that. And it is peace. It will give you peace. It will give you assurance. It is valuable. It is a comfort, right? What
Mhm.
is your only comfort in life and in death? It is that. But I want to be honest with people, and I want them to know that society's still going to be poking them. It's still going to be saying, hey, pick up that boulder, go back up the hill. And so in the context of that passage, I'm trying to acknowledge, all right, there's no 5-step plan.
Mhm.
There's no technique for fixing society. So what do we do? So how do we go about this? And kind of where I've landed on that is this idea that we need to, instead of another technique, we need to be people who have this radical and, from the world's perspective, an absurd hope in God and his provision. I don't know how society changes. I don't know how it improves, but I do believe that God is a God who can radically change things. Um, and I think that we have an obligation to make spaces where we are mutually supporting each other.
Mm.
And we already have that built into our faith in churches, right? So what are we doing in our churches to mutually support each other? Are we doing that? Because I think that's going to allow us to be sustained long term. Because if we're doing this on our own, it's going to be very hard to bear this burden.
James K.A. Smith, talks about counter liturgies, these rebellions, and our Kelly Kapik, which you also know and you've done a lot with. He talks a bit about that. Well, and I think it is interesting to note that we already do have that mechanism there, which is the church. The church, unfortunately, in many circumstances, hasn't addressed these issues, but if they've been just as affected by it, and in some ways propagated it without knowing it. In order to be efficient, to grow, and in it, from an outsider's perspective, it looks successful, at least the vestiges or the appearance of it. But there is something that you're seeing with inside as the inside is starting to crumble, because people are starting to see that it's not about really encountering God or knowing God or belonging to God. There's the idea of a self-help, a self-fix, which is got a Christian terminology attached to it, such as sanctification, but really implicit within it is this idea of push your boulder, as you said, the metaphor that you used. I think that having the conversation, though, is identifying it, and as you said earlier, it's giving it the language necessary, because once you can name it, which is part of our responsibility as co-creators with God, in that he's given us the responsibility, just as he did Adam, to name his world. We name our world, we identify it, then we can find out ways how the gospel then confronts it. And it gives us a comfort in the middle of that, saying that we can cease from striving in that regard. And that's what I really do appreciate, where you're going and how you went about it. And I liked how you went about it, because you brought in such a philosophical part, you brought in literature, you brought in a lot of things that I wasn't as familiar with, and you made me think a little bit different than I normally would. So I'm encouraged by that. It's just that finding that belonging community, I think, is the toughest part. We interviewed on the show Jim Wilder. I don't know if you know who Jim Wilder is, Michael Hendricks, neurotheologians. And neurotheology is what they're kind of their pioneers of, where they're noticing how the brain actually goes about spiritual formation. And a lot of our spiritual formation in our churches is taking place, focuses on the left side of our brain, but spiritual formation actually takes place on the right side of our brain. So it's the idea that even it's part of the belonging aspect of being alongside one another, the social dimension. I mean, yes, we are thinking creatures. Yes, we're to be not conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. But there is this idea that we belong to a group of people, and that we're a body, and that within that, when we understand that we belong, there is the safety net to cease from striving. Unfortunately, it seems to me that a lot of churches, rather than stop that, have actually created more of it and nourished that mentality. And I've just seen it in a lot of different churches, where they're constantly, let's get bigger, let's get better, let's do this, rather than bring people into a true encounter with the one who made them, the one who redeemed them, the one who purchased them. And that's why I find, when you mentioned the Heidelberg Catechism, which Kelly did too, by the way, I don't know if you've read his book. He mentions it, and I read him back, and I was like, come on, they had a conversation with each other about this. I did appreciate that, because there is this comfort that brings us a stability, a connection through time, a way to stop. But as you said, and I was enjoying your solution, and I was frustrated by it when you said there is not a solution, and I was like, darn it. I read all this. Why did he wait to the end?
I know. I tried. I know. It's such a bait and switch. I wish I had a 5-step plan to fix it all.
Oh no, but it's also free, because there's not a 5-step plan.
There isn't. There really isn't. But I think we could do just the hard work of being in the church community, and some of the things that you just mentioned. I mean, if we can just stop doing so much of the technique in the church and focus so much on the gospel and being embodied, that will do so much good. You used the word encounter. This is something that Ellul talks a lot about in some other works, Presence in the Modern World, being able to actually encounter our neighbor. He argues that in the modern world, that's something that we just fail to do, that we don't actually encounter each other face to face, that we encounter kind of a shadow, or we encounter artifacts of culture. I think a lot about, even in small groups or life groups or whatever you want to call them, how easy it is to meet together and have really just a bunch of small talk, so that I don't want to use the word authenticity, but there's just
vulnerability.
There's just no vulnerability.
Like true vulnerability, not just socially acceptable. To me, there's socially acceptable vulnerability where I can tell you, like, I'm struggling with pride. Okay, right. That's a safe one. But if I went, well, I'm struggling looking at, some type of pornography, or, I found out that my kid is doing this or that. I mean, very rarely do you find that. But I think when you have it, that's when the real community starts to develop, when you have that type of vulnerability. Because we are really broken. We're all sinful people. And Kelly mentions this, and again, I know you're friends, where he talks about we don't confess sins together anymore.
Yeah.
There's that idea of confession, but the scripture talks about it. Confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you shall be healed. Or even, as you mentioned, we meet people, but I don't think we really encounter. This is where I've kind of harped on 2nd and 3rd John, where John leaves his ending and he says, I've written to you enough in paper and ink, and I long to see you face to face. And there is not, of course, that's not, as I like to say, he wasn't referring to Zoom. He was referring to really encountering you where you're at. And that's where that idea of presence, I think, has been really undervalued. And I'm thankful for guys such as yourself who are really starting to bring that to the forefront, that we need to be present together. And yet it's still a struggle. For those of us who are saying and identified it as a problem, it's still not easy, because as my wife says, you're here, but you're not here. You're here, you're on your phone, or you're zoned out. You need to be here. So that's what I like about but you were getting ready to say something before
who knows what that was? No,
it was just profound. I know it was.
Maybe. Yeah, it was going to be the best thing I said this whole session here. I just think we have to have hope. I think we have to have hope, and this is part of what I wanted to get at with this idea of technique, and part of what I think is so liberating with not relying on technique. So when we say, and this is kind of circling back to one of the things that you were mentioning earlier when you read that, okay, here's these. We identify the problem, we analyze it, we go through this, and I think rhetorically you ask, well, what's the alternative, and how does that give us hope? And so, well, one of the freeing things for us Christians is that when we say that we're not actually confined by technique, then we can say, okay, God, I don't, for example, with church, I don't know how I can get all the members, or even most of the members of my church, to understand and buy into this idea that we belong to you, and then practice it and embody it, and then work to encounter each other, and then work to rely on each other, and inviting each other into their homes, and to really make each other and help each other and equip each other to believe that they belong to God. Because it can't just be, it's got to be from the pulpit. It's got to be the way the church operates. It's got to be all of these things, but it's got to be throughout the week. It's got to be the way we talk to our young people. It's got to be, the example I gave with that stay-at-home mom. It's the way we do small talk. It's all of these things that we've got to have outposts of support for each other. I don't know how that happens. I don't have a 5-step plan, but the exciting thing is that doesn't stop me from hoping that God can accomplish that good work. And if I'm constrained to like a business strategy or to technique, then I've got to have that. That's my only hope. I've got to have that 5-step plan. Otherwise, I'm screwed. But because I believe in a God who can work miracles, I can say, all right, here are steps I can take. And I can hope all things, and I can believe that God can accomplish this good work. And my task is to be faithful to the things that God has put before me, and trust Him for the fruit. And to me, that gives me hope. Because I'm both I tend to be kind of a realist and an optimist, which might not make sense, but I don't like to be a pessimist, but I also look at the world and it seems like a big mess. So that's where I'm at.
Well, it is a mess, but it's always been a mess. It just, we're more aware of the mess. We have bigger tools. I like to draw attention to Paul. We have this tendency to look at the early church and say, hey, they were perfect. I want to be in that Acts chapter 2 world where they were fellowshipping and had everything together in common. But that didn't last forever.
Yeah.
And you have the reports where, Paul kind of laments and he says, I've been in danger in the street. I've been in danger in the city. I've been naked. I've been thirsty. I've been hungry. I've been betrayed. I went through all this. And then I've got my daily anxiety for all these churches that I keep hearing about. In Corinth, I hear that a guy's sleeping with his stepmother and they're getting drunk at communion. In Philippi, these two women are fighting with one another. In Thessalonica, they're quitting their jobs and setting up tents, waiting for Jesus to come back. I mean, for crying out loud, there's just a lot of issues that are going on in these fledgling churches. And so I think that that to me is freeing, because I realize that there's not a perfect church. I mean, even when I hear people say, let's be a New Testament church, and I'm like, which one? The one that lost its first love, the one that was tolerating the Nicolaitans, but I do find that every generation has to redefine the faith in their time, and they have to find and affirm. The gospel affirms something in every culture and in every time, and it challenges something in every culture and in every time. And this is where I think that modernity, while it is a wonderful thing in that it's brought a lot of modern conveniences our way. I mean, who wants to go back to some of the bloodletting? We don't need to go back to that. We have surgeries, we have techniques. Those things have been good. But when those things have been brought into the church and we have been dehumanized in the process, because we have seen the gospel as a product rather than a personal encounter, I think this is where we have to stop and say, okay, we have to redefine ourselves and redefine our faith as they would say in the Reformation, semper reformandum. We have to always be reforming. And this is where I think your work is important, because it's shining, kind of like putting up a mirror and identifying the faults of our own time and saying, this is what the gospel of challenging, this is what it's affirming, but this is where we need to find a way forward. And I may not know it, but I'm a part of the conversation with you in that journey. And I think that's why your book is an important work. What do you see, or what have been the responses that you have received from your book thus far?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So it's there has been a spectrum. I've gotten a lot of people who have thanked me for, as we talked about earlier, for giving a vocabulary to things that they have felt, and that's been really affirming, because my favorite books have done that very thing. I mean, we mentioned Chuck Taylor, Charles Taylor, and actually Jacques Ellul. Those are two authors who gave me names for things that I felt intuitively, but I couldn't piece together, and I didn't understand. And I love that. And so that's been really affirming. There have been some people who have made some comparisons to Capic, and that's been really flattering, because Capic's fantastic.
Is it Capic? I've been saying Capic. It's Capic?
I don't know. Now you've got me doubting. Now you've got me doubting.
That's the first question I'm going to ask you tomorrow. Is it Capic or Capic? Okay, KK.
Anyway, Kelly.
I
know Kelly. And some to Truman, some overlap with Truman's book, and so that's been interesting. There's been some some criticism, some just about the wordiness. So it was interesting saying it was compact. I'm a compact writer. Writing is an interesting process, because you just get a spectrum. Some have said it's too academic, and some have said it's not academic enough. And so you just say, okay, yes, you're right. No, it's not an academic book.
It's not an academic book, but a buddy of mine, he's like, I want more footnotes. And I was like, okay, that's fine. Whatever.
Yeah. I mean,
everybody's got their thing, everybody's got their thing.
I understand. Yeah.
But it's a labor of love. What now that the book is out, and you wrote it when? I mean, when did you actually write it?
I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, I think the idea started percolating in 2019, and so 20 maybe started 2019, 2020. When did it come out? Last year? Yeah. Yeah. So 2019 through 2020, I think. You know, I don't know that I wish I would have done anything different. And here's the reason I say that is because the only thing I could have done different would be to spend an infinite amount of time on it, right? So for example, I found this fantastic quote from C.S. Lewis just recently that fit exactly what I'm talking about. But I found lots of other quotes from other people that could have fit in the book as well. And I could have included, but that could go on forever. And I also could have improved the quotes or the prose, and I could have tightened things up and expanded on sections and cut things and improve things. But one of the things I've learned as a writer is that you just have to turn in things. And I don't regret anything in the book. I don't. There's nothing in it that I think, gosh, that was dumb, or I really needed to clarify that, or there's nothing like that in the book. There are lots of things that I wish that I could have improved on, but they're all things that I could spend the rest of my life. Like I could just keep polishing forever. And so if I say that I could have improved the prose, what I'm really saying to you right now is that my next book I should never turn in. And so that's that's why I can't say that. I have to just turn stuff in. I just got to turn stuff in. And every time I turn stuff in, what's funny about this book, and this is true with each of my books. What's funny about this book is that when I started, I was like, I love this idea. Like I believe in this idea, and I still really, really believe in this idea. And I believe that this idea is really important. And I thought to myself, I don't know that I'm the person to write this, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull it off, but I really believe in this idea. And when I turned it in, I still felt like, like your friend's comments with the footnotes. It's like, there are things that I could have done that could have made this a really great book. But one of my most encouraging lines, I'm abandoning that sentence. I'm like you with the cough. I'm abandoning that sentence. One of my most encouraging lines are from T.S. Eliot, and it's about the subject of writing. He's actually talking about writing. At this time, he's the best poet, the most renowned poet in the 20th century in the English language. And he says, for us, there is only the trying. The rest is not our business. And that's what keeps me going, and that's why I turn stuff in instead of just polishing forever. So I have to just say, this is not the great book that was in my head, which is like way up here. That was perfect. I know there's this great book that would have been a masterpiece and that lives up to the idea, but I'm going to turn in the book that I can turn in because I have to spend time with my family, and that's okay. So I feel your friends' concerns. I feel the comments from people who are like, it's too wordy. I'm like, yeah. The people who are like, it's not academic. I'm like, I hear you. You're right. It should have been more academic. And the people who are like, it's too academic. I'm like, well, I don't know about that one, but yeah, I know, I understand. One of the things is there have been a number of people who say, the beginning is too dark. And I understand. I do ask a lot of the reader, we talked earlier about asking them to sort of descend before I give them that hope. And that was something I wrestled a lot with. I tried to give some gospel hope at the end of each chapter, in the first few chapters, because I ask you to sit through 3 or 4 chapters before I get to you belong to Christ, and that's the ultimate hope. But the reason I did that was because I thought, okay, we need to, as I said earlier, we need to look squarely at the face of this problem in order for us to get through it. So
So how can people support you or follow you and what you're doing?
yeah, so you can go to O, which stands for Orville, or Orval. You can go to I was gonna wait for you. oalannoble.com is my website, and you can find my various social media, and I've got a Substack, and my books, and various things there. That's probably the best way to connect with me.
Awesome. Well, Alan, thank you for coming on the show. I've had a really fun time talking about You Are Not Your Own, and I would highly recommend people get the book. Thank you for coming on the show.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks.